There's a tree bark that eliminates pain faster than aspirin, reduces fever without side effects, and costs $3 for a supply that lasts an entire year. Not a supplement, not a wellness trend, a documented pharmaceutical compound that predates Bayer by 4,000 years. Egyptian physicians prescribed it in 3000 BC. Hippocrates gave it to women in labor. Roman legionnaires chewed it on the march through Gaul. Every civilization on every continent that had access to willow trees arrived at the exact same conclusion independently. This bark stops pain. Then, in 1897, a chemist at a German company named Bayer isolated the active compound, modified it slightly, filed a patent, and turned a $3 bark into the most profitable drug in human history. They did not abandon the original because it failed. They buried it because they could not charge you $12 a bottle for something growing in every riverbank on Earth. This is the story of willow bark. The original painkiller that empires trusted and a single corporation spent over a century making sure you forgot. The story begins not in a laboratory. It begins on the bank of the Nile River around 3000 BC, where Egyptian healers were already documenting something they had known for generations. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts in human history, describes the preparation of willow bark tea for pain and inflammation. The instructions are precise. Boil the bark in water, strain the liquid, administer to the patient. The Egyptians were not guessing. They were following a protocol refined over centuries of observation. It worked then. The chemistry behind it has not changed once in 5,000 years. Hippocrates recorded the same compound around 400 BC. He recommended willow bark extract specifically for fever and the pain of childbirth. The father of modern medicine, the man every physician on earth still swears an oath to, was prescribing a $3 bark that any person can buy in bulk today. Roman physicians carried dried willow bark in their medical kits alongside surgical tools. Garrison records from Roman frontier forts describe soldiers being treated with bark preparations after battle wounds. Not opium, not wine, willow bark. Because it worked and it was available everywhere there was water. This pattern repeated across every civilization independently. In China, traditional medicine practitioners used willow bark for joint inflammation and fever reduction for over 2,000 years before any European scientist published a paper on the subject. In North America, dozens of indigenous nations used willow bark and willow root preparations for headaches, arthritis, and infection-related fever long before European contact. The Cherokee, the Iroquois, the Blackfoot, all of them. Different languages, different continents, different centuries, the same bark, the same result. That is not folklore. That is 4,000 years of documented clinical observation across the entire surface of the earth. In medieval Europe, monastery physicians kept willow bark as a standard item in their apothecary stores. Benedictine monks in the 11th century documented its use for joint swelling in elderly patients. Parish records from rural England describe local healers distributing willow bark preparations to farm laborers suffering from rheumatic pain after wet harvest seasons. This was not fringe practice. This was the standard of care for pain management across an entire continent for over 1,000 years. Every rural healer, every monastery physician, every military surgeon who had access to willow trees used this bark as their first response to pain and fever. The knowledge was so widespread, so deeply embedded in practical medicine, that it required a deliberate and sustained industrial effort to erase it from common awareness. And that effort came. During the American Civil War, Union field surgeons documented willow bark as an emergency fever treatment when quinine supplies ran out at Ford Field hospitals. Medical records from the Army of the Potomac describe the preparation being administered to soldiers with wound fever along the Rappahannock River in 1863. The bark was not a last resort born of desperation. It was a known tool that trained military physicians reached for because it worked. That institutional knowledge survived 2 more generations of military medicine before the pharmaceutical industry's influence over medical education finally finished what the boardroom had started. The active compound responsible for all of this is called salicin. When you consume willow bark, your body converts salicin into salicylic acid. Salicylic acid inhibits the same inflammatory enzymes that every modern painkiller targets. The mechanism is identical to aspirin. The difference is that salicylic acid from willow bark releases gradually as your digestive system processes the bark. This means the effect is sustained, not spiked. Pain researchers at the University of Maryland reviewed the existing clinical literature on willow bark and found that it performs comparably to standard doses of aspirin for lower back pain, osteoarthritis, and headache. Comparable performance, 1/10 the cost. No patent, no monthly purchase cycle. No branded bottle with a 900% markup sitting on a pharmacy shelf. Now here is where the story turns dark. In 1897, a chemist at Bayer named Felix Hoffmann was looking for a way to help his father, who suffered from severe arthritis. His father could not tolerate the stomach irritation caused by salicylic acid in its natural form. Hoffmann acetylated the compound, adding a chemical modification that made it gentler on the stomach lining. The result was acetyl salicylic acid. Bayer named it aspirin and filed the patent in 1899. And this is where the history of the pharmaceutical industry does not want you to examine too closely begins. Bayer did not invent the pain-relieving mechanism. Bayer did not discover salicin. Bayer did not identify the inflammatory pathway that salicylic acid disrupts. All of that knowledge had existed for 4,000 years. What Bayer invented was a slightly modified version of a molecule that nature had already perfected. Then they patented that modification, built a global manufacturing and distribution network around it, and spent the next century making absolutely sure that the original source of that molecule was never discussed in any pharmacy, any medical school, or any mainstream health publication. The strategy was elegant and ruthless. By the 1920s, Bayer and the companies that followed them had built an entire infrastructure of influence. Medical schools began receiving funding from pharmaceutical companies. Curriculum decisions about what counted as legitimate medicine shifted toward patentable synthetic compounds and away from plant-based preparations. The word herbal became synonymous with unscientific in mainstream medical culture, not because the plants stopped working, but because plants cannot be patented. You cannot file a patent on a willow tree. You cannot charge a licensing fee for bark that grows on every continent. You cannot build a subscription model around a preparation that any person can make in their own kitchen with boiling water and a $3 bag of dried bark. So the industry did not ban it. They did something more effective. They simply stopped teaching it. By 1950, an entire generation of physicians had graduated from medical school without ever hearing willow bark mentioned in a clinical context. The Ebers Papyrus sat in museum archives. Hippocrates was quoted constantly in medical ethics discussions and almost never in pharmacology lectures. The 4,000-year clinical record of salicin-based pain relief had been quietly reclassified as ancient history rather than active medical knowledge. Aspirin sat on every pharmacy counter at prices that generated billions, and the tree that made it all possible stood unacknowledged beside every river on earth. The numbers behind the suppression are not subtle. The global over-the-counter pain relief market generates over $30 billion in annual revenue. Aspirin, ibuprofen, naproxen, and acetaminophen account for the overwhelming majority of that figure. Every single one of those compounds either directly derives from salicylic acid chemistry or targets the same inflammatory pathways that willow bark has addressed for 4,000 years. The average American household spends over $200 per year on over-the-counter pain relievers. For headaches, back pain, joint inflammation, and fever, that a $3 bag of dried bark handles through the same biochemical mechanism. A $3 annual supply versus $200 in branded tablets. That ratio is so economically devastating to the pharmaceutical model that the industry cannot allow it to be discussed in mainstream channels. Here is the science that makes this undeniable. A randomized controlled trial published in the American Journal of Medicine in 2000 followed patients with chronic lower back pain over a 4-week period. The group receiving willow bark extract reported significantly greater pain reduction than the placebo group. A follow-up study published in Rheumatology compared willow bark extract directly against standard doses of a common prescription anti-inflammatory. The willow bark group showed equivalent pain relief scores at the end of the study period, equivalent clinical outcomes, a fraction of the cost. A preparation that requires no prescription, no pharmacy visit, and no monthly resupply because a single $3 purchase lasts weeks. A 2001 study from the same research group tested willow bark extract specifically against osteoarthritis of the hip and knee, two conditions that together affect over 32 million Americans and generate billions annually in pharmaceutical and surgical revenue. The patients receiving willow bark reported meaningful reduction in pain and stiffness. The researchers noted that the gradual release mechanism of natural salicin may actually produce a more sustained anti-inflammatory effect than the rapid spike and crash cycle of standard aspirin tablets. The original is not just comparable. In specific applications, it is biochemically superior. What the pharmaceutical lobby never advertises is that aspirin's modification comes with a documented cost. Acetyl salicylic acid is significantly more aggressive on the stomach lining than the natural salicin compound it replaced. The American Gastroenterological Association estimates that regular aspirin use contributes to over 100,000 hospitalizations per year in the United States due to gastrointestinal bleeding and ulceration. That is not a rare side effect. That is a mass medical consequence of replacing a gentle 4,000-year-old natural preparation with a patented synthetic modification, then spending a century telling the public that the synthetic version was the scientific advancement. The modification that Bayer sold as a stomach-friendly improvement created an entirely new category of pharmaceutical injury, and the natural original that avoided that injury was simultaneously being erased from medical education. The industry created the problem and sold you the solution, then buried the thing that never caused the problem in the first place. German healthcare tells a different story. Germany has maintained a parallel regulatory framework for herbal medicines through its Commission E, a scientific body that has formally evaluated plant-based compounds since the 1970s. Commission E approved standardized willow bark extract as a legitimate treatment for fever, pain, and rheumatic conditions based on documented clinical evidence. German physicians can and do recommend it. German pharmacies stock it. German patients use it. The knowledge was never fully erased in Germany because the regulatory environment never allowed the pharmaceutical lobby to complete the suppression. The result is that German consumers have access to a $3 pain solution that American consumers have been trained to dismiss as unscientific. Same compound, same clinical evidence, different country, different outcome. Because the suppression was cultural and regulatory, not scientific. Now, here is exactly what you need to do. Go to any health food store, bulk herb supplier, or online retailer and search for white willow bark. The dried bark of Salix alba, the white willow tree. A 100-gram bag costs between $3 and $6 and contains enough material for weeks of use. For a basic pain relief preparation, bring 2 cups of water to a boil in a small saucepan. Add 1 tablespoon of dried white willow bark. Reduce heat and simmer gently for 15 to 20 minutes. The water will turn a deep amber color. Strain the bark completely and let the liquid cool to a comfortable drinking temperature. 1 cup of this preparation delivers a clinically meaningful dose of salicin equivalent to the active content in a standard low-dose aspirin tablet. For joint pain and arthritis, consume 1 cup of the preparation twice daily with food. The gradual release of salicin through natural digestion means the anti-inflammatory effect builds and sustains over hours rather than peaking and declining within 90 minutes the way a tablet does. For headache and fever, a single cup taken at onset is sufficient for most people. The effect arrives within 30 to 45 minutes, which is comparable to tablet absorption time. For preventive use in chronic inflammatory conditions, a daily maintenance cup in the morning has been documented in European clinical practice for decades, particularly in Germany, where herbal medicine maintains a much stronger foothold in mainstream healthcare than in the United States. If you prefer a more concentrated preparation, you can reduce the simmered liquid by half over low heat after straining. The result is a dense extract that stores in a glass jar in the refrigerator for up to 2 weeks. 1 teaspoon of this concentrate, diluted in warm water, delivers a full therapeutic dose in a fraction of the volume. Backcountry campers and overlanders have been using this method for years. A small glass jar of willow bark concentrate weighs almost nothing, survives temperature variation, requires no refrigeration for short trips, and handles headache, fever, and muscle inflammation from a single compact preparation that costs less than $1 to produce. Compare that to a blister pack of ibuprofen that runs out after 4 doses and contributes plastic waste to every campsite it touches. One important truth you deserve to hear. Willow bark contains salicin, which means the same contraindications that apply to aspirin apply here as well. If you have a known aspirin sensitivity, a bleeding disorder, or are taking blood-thinning medications, consult a physician before using willow bark preparations. Children under 16 should not use salicin-containing preparations due to the same considerations that apply to aspirin in pediatric use. The bark is not magic, and it is not without consideration. But for the vast majority of healthy adults managing everyday pain, inflammation, and fever, it is a 4,000-year-old solution that the pharmaceutical industry has worked for over a century to remove from your awareness. Bayer made its first billion on a molecule that was already 4,000 years old when they filed the patent. They changed the delivery mechanism, they built the distribution infrastructure, and then they spent a century funding medical education, lobbying regulatory bodies, and shaping public perception to ensure that the tree the molecule came from was never mentioned in the same sentence as legitimate medicine. The willow did not change. The chemistry did not change. The inflammatory pathways in your body did not change. What changed was who controlled the story about how to address them. Hippocrates prescribed this bark. Roman army physicians carried it across 3 continents. The Ebers, Papyrus documented it 5,000 years ago on the banks of the Nile. $30 billion in annual revenue depends on you believing that the only way to address pain is through a branded tablet manufactured in a factory and sold at a 900% markup at the pharmacy counter. The willow tree has been growing along every river on earth the entire time. Nobody has ever been able to charge a licensing fee for it, and that is precisely why you were never told its name.